My name is Olivia Grant. I'm 37 years old. And the day that changed everything didn't come in a raid or a courtroom or even in the moment a child I rescued clutched my hand. It came in my mother's dining room on Thanksgiving night when my uncle smirked and said, "She wastes her life chasing shadows." The laughter that followed crashed over me like glass shards. Turkey steam rose from the table, candles flickered against autumn centerpieces, and 14 family members who should have known better joined in my uncle's assessment of my meaningless career. I sat there with my frozen smile, hands clenched beneath the mahogany table, carrying secrets about human trafficking operations that would keep them awake for weeks. While they mocked my life's work, they thought they knew who I was. They were about to discover exactly how wrong they'd been. Every Thanksgiving at Mom's house feels like an annual performance review, where I'm always the underperforming employee. The dining room table groaned under the weight of tradition, a 20-pound turkey glazed to golden perfection, cranberry sauce the color of rubies catching the candlelight, sweet potato casserole topped with marshmallows that looked like tiny clouds. The whole Norman Rockwell tableau, complete with 3 generations of Grants gathered to count their blessings and catalog my failures. I sat in the same chair I'd occupied for 37 years, between my cousin Jake, who'd just bought his 3rd rental property, and my sister Beth, who was 6 months pregnant with her 2nd child. Across from me, Uncle Robert held court like he did every year, dispensing wisdom about success and failure to anyone within earshot. "Olivia's still working for the government," Mom announced when conversation turned to career updates, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal concern that barely masked disappointment. "Same job, 15 years now." Same job. Like I was processing parking tickets instead of infiltrating criminal organizations that sold human beings like commodities. "Government work," Uncle Robert repeated, shaking his head with the kind of theatrical disappointment he'd perfected over 63 years of offering unsolicited opinions. "Steady paycheck, I suppose, but no real growth potential." No real growth potential. The man saying this had spent his career selling insurance and considered his biggest achievement getting invited to the company Christmas party every year. "She wastes her life chasing shadows," he continued, carving himself another slice of turkey with the authority of someone who'd never chased anything more dangerous than a late mortgage payment. Always has. Even as a kid, making up stories about monsters under the bed. The laughter that followed crashed over me like broken glass. 14 family members who should have known better, who should have trusted that maybe, just maybe, I'd built a life worth respecting, joined in his casual dismissal of everything I'd sacrificed for the past 15 years. I gripped my fork until my knuckles turned white, feeling every syllable like a brand against my skin. "Nearly 40, nothing to show for it," Aunt Linda muttered into her wine glass, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "No husband, no children, no real career advancement." "Some people never grow up," Jake chimed in, probably thinking he was being clever. "Still playing cops and robbers instead of building something real." Cops and robbers. If he only knew that 3 days ago, I'd been crouched in a warehouse in Baltimore, watching through night vision goggles as a trafficking crew prepared to move 12 children, the youngest was 7 across state lines, to buyers who would destroy their lives for profit. But I couldn't tell them that. Couldn't explain that my shadow chasing involved 18-month undercover operations that required me to disappear so completely that even my own family thought I was wasting my life in some forgettable government cubicle. The memory hit me unbidden, sitting in this same dining room when I was 10 years old, watching Dad teach my older brother Marcus how to carve the Thanksgiving turkey. "Men do the carving, sweetheart," Dad had said when I'd asked if I could try. "You just worry about setting the table and helping your mother in the kitchen." Even then, I'd stared at that carving knife and wondered when I'd be trusted with something sharper than dinner plates and cloth napkins. When someone would believe I was capable of handling real responsibility, instead of just supporting everyone else's accomplishments. Now, 27 years later, I carried a Glock 19 and had clearances that would make most federal employees jealous. But to them, I was still the little girl who wasn't quite ready for grown-up tools. "The thing about Olivia," Uncle Robert continued, warming to his annual theme, "is that she's always been too idealistic. Always thought she could save the world or catch the bad guys or whatever fantasy was running through her head that week. Save the world. Catch the bad guys. Fantasy." I thought about Maria Santos, age 8, who I'd found chained to a radiator in a crack house in Phoenix. About David Kim, 12 years old, who'd been sold by his own uncle to a trafficking ring operating out of massage parlors in 3 states. About Carmen Rodriguez, 14, who'd been beaten so badly by her captors that she hadn't spoken a word in the 6 months since I'd pulled her out of a basement in Newark. Those children weren't fantasies. Their nightmares were real. And stopping the monsters who preyed on them was the most important work I'd ever done. But I sat there in silence, picking at my mashed potatoes, carrying secrets that would haunt these people for the rest of their lives if they knew the truth. You know what Olivia's problem is? This from my cousin Sarah, who managed a Target store and considered herself an expert on career advancement. She never learned to be practical. Never figured out that sometimes you have to compromise your dreams to build a real life. Compromise your dreams. Build a real life. While she was climbing the retail management ladder, I'd spent the past 3 months living in a studio apartment in East Baltimore, posing as a drug-addicted prostitute to gain access to a trafficking network that was moving children through a pipeline stretching from Mexico to Canada. I'd learned to speak with a Baltimore accent, to walk with the defeated posture of someone whose spirit had been broken by addiction and abuse, to blend into a world where hope went to die so I could gather the intelligence needed to save lives. Real life, to me, meant waking up every morning knowing that the work I did might mean the difference between a child living or dying. It meant sacrificing normal relationships, normal holidays, normal everything, because someone had to stand between the innocent and the monsters. But to them, real life meant mortgage payments and performance reviews and arguing with teenagers about curfew. Uncle Robert raised his wine glass then, the gesture commanding attention, like he was delivering a toast at a corporate banquet. To real jobs, he announced, his voice carrying across the dining room with the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything. To real families and real success. Not fairy tales and phantom chases. The laughter that followed was louder this time, more sustained, like they were all relieved to have someone finally say what they'd been thinking for years. I sat there, fork suspended halfway to my mouth, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt during months of undercover work in hostile territory. At least when I was surrounded by human traffickers and drug dealers, I knew they were the enemy. Here, surrounded by people who shared my DNA, I was just the family disappointment who'd never learned when to give up her childish dreams. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that in 72 hours, everything would change. In 72 hours, I would lead the largest coordinated raid against human trafficking in DEA history. 17 locations across 6 states. 43 arrests. 27 children rescued. In 72 hours, their shadow chaser would dismantle a criminal network that had been operating with impunity for over a decade. But tonight, I was just Olivia, the nearly 40 niece who'd never learned to grow up, sitting at a table full of people who measured success in salary figures and social media posts, while I carried the weight of knowing that children were being sold like cattle just a few hundred miles away. Tonight, I smiled and nodded and let them think they knew who I was. Tomorrow, I'd go back to work saving lives they'd never know were in danger. And in 3 days, they'd finally understand exactly what kind of shadows I'd been chasing all along. Uncle Robert was still holding his wine glass in the air, basking in the laughter that followed his toast to real success, when the knock came at the front door. 3 sharp raps, official and unmistakable. The kind of knock that cuts through conversation and makes everyone stop what they're doing because it sounds important in a way that social visits never do. Mom looked confused, glancing at her watch. Who could that be? It's after 8 on Thanksgiving. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Dad pushed back from the table, muttering about people having no sense of timing. But I was already standing. My phone had been buzzing for the past 10 minutes with messages I couldn't check at the dinner table, and something in my gut told me this wasn't a coincidence. "I'll get it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The dining room fell silent as I walked toward the front hallway. 14 pairs of eyes following me with the kind of curiosity that comes when ordinary evening takes an unexpected turn. Behind me, I could hear Uncle Robert making some joke about government workers getting called in on holidays, his voice carrying that familiar note of superiority. I opened the front door and felt November air rush in, cold enough to make the candles on the dining room table flicker. 3 figures stood on Mom's front porch, their breath visible in the frigid air, wearing dark overcoats that immediately marked them as federal law enforcement. Assistant Director Michael Chen stepped forward first, his badge visible on his belt, his expression carrying the kind of professional gravity that meant this wasn't a social visit. "Special Agent Grant," he said, his voice formal but warm, "I apologize for interrupting your family dinner." Behind him stood Deputy Director Sarah Martinez and, to my complete shock, Director Patricia Hawkins herself, the head of the entire DEA, a woman whose schedule was booked months in advance and who didn't make house calls unless something extraordinary had happened. "Directors," I said, my mind racing to process why the highest levels of DEA leadership were standing on my mother's front porch on Thanksgiving night. "Is everything all right?" "More than all right," Director Hawkins said, stepping into the foyer as cold air swirled around us, extinguishing one of the decorative candles in the hallway. "May we come in?" From the dining room, I could hear the murmur of confused voices, chairs scraping against hardwood as my family craned their necks to see who had arrived. Uncle Robert's voice carried clearly, "Probably some work emergency. Government employees never really get time off." "Of course," I said, leading them toward the dining room where 14 family members sat frozen with forks halfway to their mouths, their celebration suspended in awkward curiosity. The sight that greeted the directors was pure Americana, the golden turkey still steaming on its platter, cranberry sauce gleaming like jewels in cut crystal bowls. My family arranged around the table in their Thanksgiving best, looking like extras from a holiday movie who'd suddenly found themselves in a different kind of scene entirely. "Good evening," Director Hawkins said, her voice carrying the authority that comes from running one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world. "I'm Director Patricia Hawkins, Drug Enforcement Administration. I apologize for interrupting your family gathering." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Uncle Robert's wine glass froze halfway to his lips. Aunt Linda's mouth fell open. Jake was staring like he'd just witnessed something impossible. "We're here," Assistant Director Chen continued, "to present Special Agent Olivia Grant with a commendation that couldn't wait for normal business hours." "Special Agent." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. I watched my family's faces as they processed what they'd just heard. Not government employee, not desk worker, special agent. "Agent Grant," Director Hawkins said, turning to face me with the kind of respect usually reserved for peer-level officials. "Would you please step forward?" My legs felt like water, but I moved to the center of the dining room where moments earlier I'd been dismissed as a shadow-chasing failure. The same room where I'd spent 37 years being told I wasn't quite good enough, wasn't quite successful enough, wasn't quite real enough. Deputy Director Martinez opened a small velvet box, revealing a medal that caught the candlelight like captured fire. The DEA Administrator's Award for Exceptional Service, an honor given to fewer than a dozen agents each year. "Special Agent Olivia Grant," Director Hawkins's voice carried clearly through the stunned silence, "for your leadership in Operation Bright Dawn, the successful dismantling of a major human trafficking network operating across 6 states." She pinned the medal to my sweater, the weight of it unfamiliar against my chest. Around the table, I could see my family struggling to process what they were witnessing. "Operation Bright Dawn," Director Hawkins continued, "resulted in 43 arrests, the seizure of assets worth over $12 million, and most importantly, the rescue of 27 children, the youngest of whom was 6 years old. 27 children. The number hit the room like a physical blow. I watched Uncle Robert's face go white, watched Aunt Linda's hand fly to her mouth, watched Jake stare at me like I was someone he'd never seen before. Agent Grant spent 18 months undercover, infiltrating a criminal organization that was trafficking children for sexual exploitation across state lines. Her courage, dedication, and tactical brilliance directly resulted in saving lives and bringing justice to victims who had no other voice. The medal felt heavy against my chest, heavier than any piece of jewelry I'd ever worn. But it wasn't the weight of the medal. It was the weight of vindication, of finally being seen for who I really was instead of who they'd assumed I'd failed to become. The operation concluded 3 days ago with simultaneous raids in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Phoenix, Seattle, and Houston. Every member of the trafficking network is now in federal custody, and every child has been safely recovered. 3 days ago. While they'd been preparing their Thanksgiving jokes about my meaningless career, I'd been coordinating the largest anti-trafficking operation in DEA history. Director Hawkins turned to address my family directly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your daughter, your niece, your sister," she said, looking at each of them in turn, "is one of the finest federal agents I've had the privilege to work with. Her dedication to protecting the innocent has been recognized at the highest levels of our government." The transformation in the room was immediate and complete. Uncle Robert set down his wine glass with shaking hands. Aunt Linda was openly crying. Jake looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. "Agent Grant," Assistant Director Chen added, "the Attorney General wanted me to personally convey his gratitude for your service. The President has been briefed on Operation Bright Dawn and specifically requested that your contribution be recognized." The President of the United States had been briefed on my work. I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with the medal on my chest. For 37 years, I'd sat at this table being told I wasn't enough. Now the highest levels of federal law enforcement were standing in my mother's dining room, explaining to my family that their shadow chaser had just dismantled a criminal empire. "We'll leave you to your family celebration," Director Hawkins said, but her eyes met mine with a look that said this wasn't just professional courtesy, this was respect, recognition, the acknowledgement I'd spent 15 years earning in rooms my family would never see. As the directors prepared to leave, Uncle Robert finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Olivia," he said, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "We had no idea." I looked at this man who'd spent the evening explaining why my life was a waste, who'd toasted to real success while dismissing everything I'd sacrificed to save lives. "No," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "You didn't." The directors left, taking their official gravity with them, but the medal remained pinned to my sweater. Physical proof that the shadows I'd been chasing were real, that the monsters I'd been hunting had faces, that the children I'd saved were sleeping safely tonight because someone had been brave enough to walk into the darkness and bring them home. As I returned to my seat at the table, the same seat where I'd been mocked and dismissed less than an hour earlier, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't need their validation anymore. I never had. The work spoke for itself. The lives saved spoke for themselves. The medal on my chest spoke louder than any family dinner conversation ever could. But watching Uncle Robert stare into his wine glass, watching Aunt Linda wipe tears from her cheeks, watching Jake look at me with something that might have been awe, I understood that sometimes vindication comes exactly when you need it most. Not because you require other people's approval to know your worth, but because sometimes the people who love you need to be reminded that love should never come with conditions, assumptions, or limits. 27 children were safe tonight because of work my family had dismissed as meaningless. That was all the validation I'd ever need. The silence that settled over the dining room after the directors left was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the tense quiet before a raid, where danger hummed beneath the surface. Not the focused silence of a surveillance operation, where lives hung in the balance. This was something deeper, heavier, the kind of silence that follows when people realize they've been catastrophically wrong about someone they thought they knew. 14 family members sat frozen around the mahogany table like figures in a tableau, their Thanksgiving celebrations suspended in stunned disbelief. Uncle Robert's wine glass remained untouched, condensation forming on the crystal as his toast to real success echoed in the air like a ghost. Aunt Linda's fork was suspended halfway to her mouth, cranberry sauce congealing on the silver tines. Jake stared at his plate like it might provide answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The golden turkey that had been the centerpiece of our celebration now sat cooling in its own juices, forgotten. The carefully arranged side dishes, sweet potato casserole, green bean almondine, stuffing still steaming from the oven, remained untouched, as if the meal itself had become secondary to processing what they'd just witnessed. I looked around the table at faces I'd known my entire life, people who'd just watched the highest levels of federal law enforcement honor their shadow-chasing niece in their own dining room. The weight of the medal against my chest felt different now, not heavy with burden, but solid with vindication. "All my life," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I wanted you to see me. Tonight, you did, but not in the way any of us imagined." Uncle Robert cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed room. Olivia, we had no idea what you actually did. Why didn't you ever tell us? I touched the metal pinned to my sweater, feeling the weight of 18 months of living a lie so complete that even my own family believed it. Because I couldn't. Because my work required that level of secrecy. Because the lives I was trying to save depended on nobody, not even you, knowing who I really was. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they'd been mocking my career as meaningless government work, I'd been living the kind of life that would have given them nightmares if they'd known the truth. A memory hit me then, sharp and vivid. 3 weeks ago, breaking down the door of a basement in Baltimore. My flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, catching the terrified eyes of a 7-year-old girl chained to a radiator. The way she'd flinched when the light hit her face, too broken to understand that I was there to help. That night, I said, my voice getting stronger with the memory, when I lifted her into the light, I knew I wasn't chasing shadows. I was chasing lives worth saving. Maria Santos, that was her name. She was safe now, placed with a foster family in Virginia who specialized in helping trafficked children recover from trauma. She still didn't speak much, but she'd started drawing pictures, flowers, and sunshine and houses with families inside. Recovery would take years, maybe decades, but she was alive and safe because someone had been willing to walk into the darkness to bring her home. 27 children, I continued, looking directly at Uncle Robert. That's how many we saved in Operation Bright Dawn. The youngest was 6. The oldest was 15. They'd been sold, traded, brutalized by people who saw them as commodities instead of human beings. Aunt Linda was crying openly now, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks in dark streams. Oh God, Olivia, we didn't know, we never knew. You never asked, I said, not unkindly but with the firmness that comes from 15 years of making hard truths clear to people who didn't want to hear them. You assumed that because my work wasn't visible, wasn't something you could brag about at dinner parties, it wasn't important. Jake found his voice, though it came out smaller than usual. But why law enforcement? Why choose something so dangerous? I thought about that 10-year-old girl watching her father teach her brother to carve the turkey, wondering when she'd be trusted with something sharper than dinner plates. About growing up in a family where being careful was valued more than being brave, where safety was prioritized over service. Because someone has to, I said simply. Because there are monsters out there who prey on children, and they count on people being too comfortable, too afraid, too busy with their real lives to stop them. The metal felt warm against my chest now, warmed by body heat and the weight of memory. It wasn't a trophy I'd won, it was a reminder of every child I'd helped save, and every one I hadn't been fast enough to reach. This metal, I said, touching it again, isn't about me. It's about them. About Maria, who drew her first picture last week. About David, who's learning to trust adults again. About Carmen, who smiled for the first time since we found her. I looked around the table one more time, at these people who'd spent 37 years measuring my worth in terms they understood: salary, status, social acceptability. Who'd never bothered to consider that worth might be measured in lives touched, in children saved, in standing between innocence and evil when nobody else would. You laughed when you thought I was chasing shadows, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silence. But the shadows were real. The monsters wearing human faces were real. And the children they hurt were real. Uncle Robert's hands were shaking as he finally set down his wine glass. I'm sorry, Olivia. I'm so deeply sorry. I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse beneath the shock. What I saw was a man confronting the reality that he'd spent years dismissing someone whose courage he'd never be tested to match. I know you are, I said, but understanding who I am shouldn't change whether you respect me. Respect should have been there from the beginning, because I'm your niece who worked hard and sacrificed for something bigger than herself. The details shouldn't matter. The truth of that statement settled over the room like dust after an explosion. They'd withheld respect not because they had evidence I was failing, but because they couldn't see value in work that didn't look like their definition of success. Mom spoke for the first time since the directors had left, her voice thick with emotion. We're proud of you, sweetheart. We should have said that years ago. I looked at my mother, this woman who'd raised me to be careful, to be safe, to choose security over uncertainty, who'd never understood why I'd chosen a path that led into darkness instead of light. "I know you are now," I said, "but I needed you to be proud of me before you knew about the medal. I needed you to trust that I'd built a life worth living, even if you couldn't see all the details." The dining room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Not stunned or shocked, but contemplative. The kind of quiet that comes when people are processing hard truths about themselves and the assumptions they've carried for years. I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd stopped needing it somewhere between my first undercover assignment and the moment I'd pulled that terrified child into the light. My worth wasn't determined by their ability to understand it. It was proven every time I put myself between predators and prey. Olivia's story reminds us that worth isn't determined by visibility, that success isn't measured in applause, and that the most meaningful lives are often lived in service to others. Pass this story to someone who's been dismissed, overlooked, or told their work doesn't matter. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remind someone that heroism comes in many forms, and the greatest heroes often work in silence. Share your thoughts in the comments, inspire someone today, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that remind us what true courage looks like.